If you want to buy the team sitting at the top of the Formula One grid today, you will need to write a very large check, $6.5 billion to be exact. This chart compares that wealth across the broader sports landscape. At an average valuation of $3.6 billion, a mid-tier F1 team is now worth more than the average franchise in the NHL, Major League Baseball, and the NBA. But if you look at the corporate filings from 10 years ago, you see a completely different reality. Since the sport began, over 150 racing teams have gone completely bankrupt. Operating an F1 team was widely considered a financial death trap. The sport's history is a story of brutal financial survival. The fact that these teams are now highly lucrative, billion-dollar asset classes is a massive economic anomaly. To understand how they got here, we have to look at the rules that used to govern the grid. For decades, Formula One operated under a simple free market business model. Teams spent whatever cash they had to find a fraction of a second on the track, creating an unregulated spending war. The financial disparity was massive. Manufacturer-backed operations could comfortably spend over $400 million a year on aerodynamics and staff, while independent garages struggled to keep their lights on. To survive, poorer teams relied on pay drivers, racers who secured a seat not through skill, but because they brought tens of millions in corporate sponsorship cash. This locked smaller teams into a cycle of structural failure. They sacrificed talent for immediate cash, which guaranteed poor on-track performance, which meant they couldn't attract real sponsors, forcing them to hire more pay drivers. Without financial regulation, motorsport inevitably devolves into a monopolized playground. A few billionaires burn fortunes simply to maintain their position, and everyone else slowly goes broke. The solution arrived in 2021 when the FIA governing body adopted a strategy from the North American sports playbook. They introduced a hard salary cap, but instead of applying it to athletes, they applied it directly to the engineering and development of the car. This $145 million cap strictly limits areas that make a car fast, like aerodynamic research and component manufacturing. However, strategic carve-outs completely exempt luxury expenses, including marketing budgets, top executive pay, and massive driver salaries. The FIA is actively tightening these rules heading into the 2026 season. They are closing accounting loopholes by forcing teams to include all annual asset depreciation and strictly allocate staff time directly into the main cost cap. By placing a hard ceiling on performance expenditures, the governing body rescued teams from their worst financial impulses. The sport transitioned from a pure spending contest into a strict business efficiency competition. At the same time, the teams are protected by the Concorde agreement. This is a highly confidential contract that guarantees a revenue-sharing pool while enforcing extreme artificial scarcity by limiting the grid to just 10 teams. This creates an almost insurmountable barrier to entry for any new franchise. We can see this play out right now with the upcoming 2026 arrival of the Cadillac Formula One team. To simply join the grid and become the 11th team, Cadillac was legally required to pay a record-breaking $450 million anti-dilution fee. That fee is designed to offset the financial dilution of splitting the prize pool 11 ways instead of 10. It acts as a direct $45 million cash payout deposited into the bank accounts of every single existing team. By closing off the ecosystem and aggressively monetizing new entries, Formula One transformed vulnerable, cash-strapped racing outfits into highly protected, exclusive financial strongholds. When you combine guaranteed cost limits with a closed, protected league, the global financial market immediately reacts. Institutional investors rushed in, and the primary valuation metric shifted from physical assets to massive trailing revenue multiples. Looking at this corporate financial dashboard for Mercedes, you can see the results. They operate as the absolute gold standard of motorsport profitability, bringing in £633 million in annual turnover and retaining a massive £133 million in net after-tax profit. Because driver salaries are exempt from the cost cap, they represent one of the few performance-linked costs a team can still control. By choosing to transition from a multi-million-dollar veteran like Lewis Hamilton to an entry-level rookie, a team can immediately pivot tens of millions of dollars from the payroll directly to the profit line. On the opposite end of the grid, the Haas team proves you don't need a massive facility to make money. As the smallest team on the grid, Haas achieves consistent multi-million-dollar profitability through extreme overhead reduction.
purchasing the absolute maximum number of legal parts directly from Ferrari and outsourcing their heavy engineering. Under the protection of the new financial regulations, both a massive in-house factory model and a lean, outsourced operation can reliably generate a profit. The old cycle of continuous bankruptcy has been completely eliminated. Formula One survived by recognizing that its financial structure was broken. By adopting closed leagues, revenue sharing, and strict spending caps, they stabilized the grid. This regulatory pivot finally attracted global private equity and institutional investors. These megafunds no longer view racing teams as money pits, but instead treat them as highly durable, rapidly appreciating, and completely recession-resistant financial assets. Today, success in Formula One requires a dual focus: securing a strong corporate balance sheet and maintaining highly efficient operations is exactly as critical to a team's survival as aerodynamic wind tunnel data. Formula One has successfully transitioned from a chaotic billionaire's playground into a highly regulated corporate efficiency franchise, where every dollar spent is now measured against its impact on the bottom line.
When you tune in to a Formula One race on a Sunday, you are presented with a straightforward sporting premise. 20 drivers pushing state-of-the-art machines to their physical limits, battling for position on pure merit. The best driver in the fastest car takes the checkered flag. But the race you see on television is entirely downstream of the actual competition. The real battles determining who reaches the podium are fought months in advance, in wind tunnels, in customs offices, and corporate boardrooms. As you can see in this structural breakdown, a team's success relies on mastering 3 distinct supply chains. First, the hardware and engineering pipeline. Second, the global logistical network required to move the operation. And third, the financial ladder securing driving talent. Evaluating a team based solely on their driver's lap time ignores the financial architecture that makes that lap possible. To understand modern Formula One, we have to look at the economic machinery operating behind the garage doors. The grid is quietly divided into 2 tiers of engineering capability. At the top are the works teams, organizations like Ferrari and Mercedes. These are full manufacturing operations that design and build both the aerodynamic chassis and the hybrid power unit entirely in-house. Designing the engine and the car under one roof provides an immense structural advantage. If a works team's aerodynamicists want a narrower shape at the rear of the car to generate more downforce, they simply tell their engine division to reposition the exhausts or shrink the radiators. The chassis and the power unit are built to perfectly accommodate one another. Customer teams, on the other hand, operate with a major constraint. Teams like Williams or Haas receive their engines in a crate from a manufacturer. They cannot change the physical architecture of that engine. If the manufacturer's layout requires bulky, drag-inducing side pods for cooling, the customer team must absorb that aerodynamic penalty to make the parts fit. Look at this financial ledger. To prevent manufacturers from pricing independent teams out of the sport, the FIA enforces a strict financial guardrail. Works teams are legally obligated to supply their benchmark power units to customers at a capped rate of roughly $22 million per season. Crucially, this fee is completely excluded from the customer's chassis cost cap, protecting their aerodynamic development budget. The rules also mandate that customers receive the exact same engine software and hardware mappings as the factory teams. However, physics still grants the works teams an edge. No 2 engines are manufactured perfectly identically. When a factory tests a batch of newly built engines, they naturally retain the units producing a fraction of a horsepower more for their own cars. There is also a severe asymmetry in the cost of reliability. If a customer team attempts to aggressively package their cooling system to claw back aerodynamic performance, they risk detonating the engine. A blown engine triggers multi-million-dollar replacement penalties for the customer. A works team can push their design right to the limit of overheating, knowing they can simply roll another unit off their own assembly line without paying a markup. Customer teams are legally protected from bankruptcy, but they remain locked into a structurally inferior position. The manufacturers dictate the physical and engineering ceiling for the rest of the grid before a single lap is ever driven. Once the cars are built, the operation faces a punishing operational reality. Every 2 weeks, teams must pack up to 1,400 tons of high-value cargo, clear it through international customs, and rebuild their entire garage infrastructure on a different continent. This map tracks the leapfrog strategy teams use to manage costs. Heavy, non-performance gear, like hospitality furniture and kitchen equipment, is duplicated into 5 identical sets. These sets travel by slow, highly affordable sea freight, sailing to future race locations weeks in advance to ensure the paddock is ready upon arrival. The actual race cars, engines, and IT servers cannot travel by sea. They require time-critical air freight on dedicated cargo planes. This is a blindingly fast, ruthlessly precise operation. This scale visualizes the harsh economic trade-off of air travel. Flying 35 tons of equipment across a 24-race calendar costs a team approximately $14 million a year. Under the regulations, every single dollar of that logistics bill falls directly inside the team's strictly monitored chassis cost cap. If a team plans their freight routes inefficiently or incurs rush shipping fees to replace a broken chassis, that extra expense actively cannibalizes the money they have left to research and develop a faster floor or front wing. In this regulatory environment, a logistical error literally makes the car slower. The economic realities of the engineering and logistics pipelines are intense, but the financial structure supplying the driving talent is even more restrictive. Professional motorsport begins in childhood, and the barrier to entry is astronomically high. This chart illustrates the financial staircase a driver must climb to even be considered for a seat. A competitive season of international karting requires up to $250,000. Moving into open-wheel racing in Formula 4 and Formula 3 pushes budgets well past the $1 million mark. By the final step, FIA Formula 2, a single season demands upwards of $2 million. Normal families cannot afford these figures. To keep their careers alive, young drivers rely on F1 team academies stepping in to pay for their junior seats. But this funding creates a highly leveraged dynamic known as the academy trap. In exchange for funding a driver's Formula 3 or Formula 2 campaign, team bosses demand long-term contracts. These agreements hand the team absolute legal control over the driver's career trajectory, their commercial licensing rights, and effectively block them from negotiating with rival teams on the open market. When these drivers finally reach the grid, their compensation relies heavily on performance clauses. Midfield drivers do not receive a cut of the sport's overall price pool. Instead, they are paid through specific team bonuses, often earning a structured payout of $10,000 for every single championship point they score. Team owners write these massive bonus checks happily, because every point scored directly dictates the team's placement in the constructor standings at the end of the year. Moving up just one position in those standings triggers millions of dollars in additional commercial payouts from the league. The drivers are the public face of the sport, but financially they are highly controlled corporate assets. They are leveraged through restrictive academy contracts early on and utilized as direct revenue generators for the team's balance sheet once they reach the grid. By legally restricting the price of hardware, forcing transportation costs to compete directly with aerodynamic budgets, and locking down driving talent through specialized contracts, the financial architecture of the sport has stabilized. Formula One is no longer a chaotic spending contest where billionaires burn through cash for the sake of a trophy. It is a highly organized, heavily regulated franchise system where predictability and cost controls generate consistent profit margins for the ownership groups. The next time you watch these cars line up on the grid, remember the economic machinery operating behind them. The logisticians mapping the cargo routes, finance directors auditing the budget caps, and academy managers drafting the contracts are running a race just as consequential as the drivers on the track.